Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I'm your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Deja Vu, a point-and-click adventure title developed by ICOM Simulations and published by Mindscape for the Apple Macintosh computer platform back in 1985, with a number of other computer and console ports following in later years. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 124. I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have a Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewall, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo-review kind of section. And I say pseudo-review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and or story, if the game has one. Playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoyed the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they're still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go. But I can't recommend these games to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Deja Vu. Deja Vu is a point-and-click adventure title developed by ICOM Simulations and published by Mindscape for the Apple Macintosh computer platform back in 1985, with a number of other computer and console ports following in later years. Before we can talk about Deja Vu, we need to take a step back to talk about the company behind the game, ICOM Simulations, and how their early efforts created what would become one of the first point-and-click adventure titles of all time. First, though, we need to go even further back to talk about the Apple Macintosh, a computer platform that, conveniently enough, we just spoke about during our last episode when we discussed Dark Castle. The Apple Macintosh, when it was released in 1984, was dubbed as a computer for the general population. And all you need to do is take a look at its design and the design of its interface to understand why the Macintosh was being marketed as a personal computer for general users, not necessarily hardcore technology aficionados. Unlike most computers released in the early 80s, which primarily used text-based displays and esoteric command line entries to perform simple tasks, the Macintosh was created from the ground up to be a graphical computer system, complete with files, folders, and applications being visually depicted on the computer's screen using icons, graphics, and nested hierarchies as opposed to purely text. And rather than interacting with your computer by typing commands on your keyboard, you'd instead navigate this new virtual environment using a computer mouse, which at the time of the Macintosh's release was not a pervasive user input device. The Macintosh was designed in such a way that anyone could sit down and begin using the machine. You didn't need a degree in computer science, you didn't need hard-backed spiral-bound notebooks to understand how to actually use the darn thing, you didn't even need to be particularly tech-savvy in order to get some enjoyment out of the device. If you could move a mouse cursor across the screen and click a button, you could use a Macintosh. The only question was, how were you going to use your Macintosh? Because, as most people likely realize, the capabilities of any computer system are limited by the software you have at your disposal. If you need to balance your checkbook, then you need to get a personal finance program. If you wanted to write a best-selling novel, well, you'd need a word processor. If you wanted to play a riveting new game, you'd need to buy and install that game on your computer. If you wanted to create a new game, well, that one was a little bit trickier. In nearly every episode of this podcast, we've talked about how various developers got their start creating games, and in most of those discussions, we've focused on incredibly talented programmers who taught themselves how to bend computers to their will through a mix of determination, genius-level technical know-how, and sheer willpower. But in nearly all instances, those discussions focused on a degree of technical knowledge and expertise that most typical computer users simply don't possess. There's a reason why most people buy software instead of make software, and that's because the barrier to entry for actually creating computer programs, especially in the early 80s, was exceedingly high. You couldn't sit down and whip up a brand new application or game without extensive preparation, learning, and expertise, even if you were using your brand new for everyone Apple Macintosh. The simple fact is, some tasks were too difficult for the stereotypical computer user. Interestingly, there were some individuals who believed that even complex tasks like game development could be accomplished by the general layperson, even those individuals who may have no understanding as to how to program a computer. The only thing that was missing was the right tool to let an individual's creativity run wild, which is where a man named Bill Appleton comes into our story. Bill Appleton's career started a bit differently than most of the individuals we've spoken about in prior episodes, in that as a youngster, he didn't really have any particular drive or desire to enter the computer industry, and in fact, his college-level educational pursuits were anything but technology-centric, as he primarily studied philosophy, painting, and economics, which are about as far removed from software development as any set of interests could possibly be. And actually, Appleton was so good at economics that after he graduated college in 1984, he was offered a graduate fellowship with Vanderbilt University as a means to entice him to continue his economics studies. Appleton received that proposal, which was quite frankly an amazing opportunity to continue his education, and then decided to forego it entirely, as he basically said thanks, but no thanks, and then moved back in with his parents, where he ended up living in the basement of his family's home. A somewhat unexpected, if not stereotypical, move for a recent college graduate. Now, you might be wondering why someone with such potentially lucrative opportunities in front of him would decide to instead move back home to live under a house. And the simple answer to that question is the Apple Macintosh. Like we talked about, the Macintosh was released in 1984, and as soon as Appleton saw that new, user-friendly, sleek and sexy machine, he knew his life had changed forever. He became enamored with the Apple system and began to consider that perhaps he could begin making software for the new device, specifically adventure games, despite the fact that he didn't have any software development experience to speak of at the time that he made that declaration. That did not stop him from diving headfirst into the Apple Macintosh ecosystem, though, and after spending nearly all of his savings on a shiny new Mac, he was ready to begin making his adventure game creation dreams a reality. Only that would prove to be significantly more challenging than what you might expect, as the Apple computer ecosystem was a bit less integrated than what it might have appeared to the general user population. You know how today, if you want to develop a piece of software for a computer, all you need is, you need the computer itself, as well as a software development toolkit of some kind. Back in the early days of the Apple Macintosh, however, that degree of simplicity wasn't there, even though the Macintosh itself was designed to be a simple-to-use machine. No, instead, if you wanted to create software, applications, and games for the Macintosh, you needed to own a different Apple machine, the Apple Lisa, which served as the development system for the Apple Macintosh ecosystem. This, as you might expect, would have been a sizable investment, as Apple Lisa machines cost significantly more money than a traditional Macintosh, and unless you were already a proven software developer with potentially lucrative ideas and skills, it wasn't likely you were going to spend the money to purchase a Lisa. Appleton, having no software development skills himself, was not ready to take out a loan just to buy another computer. But what he could do was learn everything he could possibly learn about Macintosh development, and over the course of a year, he would devour all sorts of technical manuals and software development guides in the hopes that one day he'd be able to put that newfound software development skill to good use. As luck would have it, though, Appleton would make the acquaintance of Alain Rossmann, an Apple employee whose job at the company was to expand the amount of software available for the new machine. And in order to do that, the company needed to recruit software developers to begin making software for the platform. Even though there was a process for doing just that, which, like we just discussed, involved purchasing an Apple Lisa, that was proving to be a tough and expensive barrier to entry for many developers. For their part, Apple began to loosen those restrictions a bit in the year following the Mac's release, which is what would lead Rossmann to provide Appleton with a copy of the Mac Assembler program, a tool that would allow anyone with the right software development know-how to create programs for the Macintosh, even if they didn't own an Apple Lisa. Well, even though Appleton didn't have much hands-on software development experience, he did have software development knowledge, as he had just spent the better part of the last year teaching himself everything there was to learn about developing for the Macintosh. Now that he had the proverbial key to the Macintosh kingdom and the knowledge required to use that key, the only thing left to do was begin creating software. And like we talked about, Appleton had one goal in mind when he began his Macintosh self-learning journey back in 1984. He wanted to create an adventure game. Only here, he didn't want to create just any old adventure game. He wanted to do something revolutionary. We have talked about adventure game history before, and in particular, we've discussed the early efforts of both the purely text-driven adventure game genre, as well as some of the innovations introduced by other pioneers in the industry, most prominently Ken and Roberta Williams, who would themselves evolve the purely text-based adventure game interface to include graphics, an influential and incredibly important development in the adventure game genre. Online Systems, and later Sierra Online's earliest titles, would marry graphics-driven viewports into a game's world with the fairly traditional text-driven parser that was standard around the time, creating the world's first series of graphically enriched adventure games. Still, despite the inclusion of graphics in these early titles, the interface itself remained a decidedly text-driven affair, and even though players could now see the game world and its characters, actually interacting with that world and those characters was anything but revolutionary. Appleton recognized the inherent limitations in what was modern adventure game design, and considered, what if he was able to marry the graphical and mouse-driven capabilities of the Apple Macintosh into a singular adventure game package, where players would be able to actually point and click their way through a narrative-centric adventure game. Sure, some commands would still require text-based inputs, but by and large, interacting with the game world would be accomplished solely using a mouse, a concept that, while not entirely new in the broader computer game industry, was something that had never been attempted before in an English-language game. Appleton thought this idea had merit. The only problem was, designing an adventure game from scratch using Macintosh assembly code might not actually result in the best game design. Sure, it could be done, and Appleton himself had the skills necessary to accomplish such a feat. But Appleton didn't want to deliver a mediocre, albeit innovative, adventure experience. He wanted to create something truly timeless, and in order to do that, he considered that he would need an adventure game design toolset to turn his vision into reality. The only issue was, there wasn't an adventure game design toolset available to general consumers in 1985, which meant one thing. Appleton would have to create his own from scratch. This is what would lead to the creation of World Builder, which has been credited as being the world's first multimedia authoring tool ever released for the general consumer market, and which would also be the first piece of software Appleton ever created. World Builder was created to allow anyone to create their own graphically enhanced point-and-click adventure games, and it was designed to intentionally take advantage of the Macintosh's inherently graphical user interface, with a number of different windows appearing on the screen at any point in time, one of which would be a window to depict a graphical display of the game's world, while several other text-based windows would be available for prospective game designers to create narration, characters, in-game items, and scripts for the underlying game engine to execute when various events would occur within a game's world. While initially World Builder was designed for Appleton's personal use, which he would leverage when he created his own point-and-click adventure game, Enchanted Scepters, Appleton would eventually join forces with Dark Castle creator Silicon Beach Software to publish World Builder for the Macintosh, providing future adventure game designers everywhere with a tool they could use to create their own games without requiring much in the way of software programming expertise. World Builder would become insanely popular, and would result in a number of adventure games being developed over the years, all of which helped to usher in the point-and-click style of adventure game during a time when adventure games on the more pervasive IBM personal computer still used text-driven interfaces for the majority of those titles. Interestingly, as Appleton was in the process of bringing point-and-click adventure games to the masses, or at least the various individuals who had purchased an Apple Macintosh, other individuals across the Macintosh landscape were beginning to pursue their own adventures in point-and-click gameplay, and one of the companies that was striving to be on the forefront of this new adventure game innovation was ICOM Simulations. Interestingly, ICOM Simulations did not begin its life as a company focused on video game development. Instead, the company was founded back in 1981 as Trademark of Quality, or TMQ, software, and the intention behind that company's founding was the creation of decidedly non-game-like software, most prominently productivity applications and tools, which, like we've talked about previously, were some of the most widely used pieces of software in the early computer industry, as computers had been designed as productivity machines, not recreational entertainment. And TMQ software, for its part, did what it could to continue promoting computers as primarily productivity devices, as the majority of its early success came about as a result of the database application FileFax, which company co-founder Todd Zipnick had created for the Apple II computer platform in 1983. TMQ's other co-founder, Craig Erickson, had seen the potential in Zipnick's creation, though Erickson did not want to keep creating productivity software forever. He believed that FileFax's success could potentially allow TMQ to expand beyond mere productivity applications into the less developed, though potentially still lucrative, computer and video game industry. Only here, the company faced a bit of a hurdle. TMQ had a talented staff, but none of them had ever worked on a game before, other than Erickson himself, who had created a text-based adventure game years earlier called The Curse of Crowley Manor. While TMQ could have potentially decided to start developing games from scratch, a different opportunity would arise that would allow them to begin dipping their toes into the game industry with decidedly less risk than if they had ventured off on their own at the start. And that opportunity would involve one of the biggest companies in gaming at the time, that being, you may have guessed, Atari. Atari was looking for ways to expand their arcade and console gaming footprint into other adjacent markets, and in the process, they began to look for talented companies to begin porting their titles to various computer platforms like the Apple II, Commodore 64, and IBM-compatible PC. Well, it turns out one of the companies that Atari would contract with was none other than TMQ Software, and under the terms of their agreement, Atari would pay TMQ to port their games to various computer platforms, with Atari providing the intellectual property and TMQ providing literally everything else, from the software development to the packaging to printed instruction manuals. For TMQ and Craig Erickson, however, this was an opportunity too good to pass up, so shortly after they entered into the deal, TMQ would begin working on ports for popular Atari titles. In the process, TMQ would begin to learn how many popular games were designed, a sort of learning through observation coupled with on-the-job training with coding those games for platforms that they were never intended to run on. As TMQ continued working on these ports and developing their own internal game development skill set, Erickson considered that the time might be right to begin shifting the company's focus away from working on established titles and instead venture out to develop their own original video games. And in particular, Erickson believed that creating a brand new state-of-the-art adventure title would be the most lucrative and interesting avenue to explore. Like I mentioned, Erickson had previously created a text-based adventure years prior entitled The Curse of Crowley Manor, though he didn't want TMQ's first original game to be constrained by his prior experience, or even the adventure game genre at large that was pervasive across the industry at the time, which aside from Enchanted Scepters and the World Builder engine, was still almost exclusively based on text parser interfaces. Instead, Erickson wanted to create a game that would take full advantage of the unique mouse-driven interface and graphical elements that came with every single Macintosh computer, which he believed would help evolve the traditional text-driven adventure game formula to become more graphical and more immersive than any adventure title that had existed up to that point. He didn't want to shortchange the story in favor of graphics and usability, though. He wanted the best of both worlds. A rich, narrative experience filled with puzzles to solve, characters to interact with, and environments to explore. The only difference was, he wanted to put the player more in control of the action than ever before. And he wanted to eliminate the text-based barrier that could sometimes make current adventure titles difficult to understand and hard to play. To put it more simply, Erickson wanted to create a point-and-click adventure game. It was this goal, and the broader desire for the company to develop original games, that drove TMQ Software to be rebranded as ICOM Simulations, with work on their very first effort, the point-and-click adventure title Deja Vu, beginning shortly thereafter. When the ICOM team sat down to begin designing Deja Vu, they knew that they were facing an uphill battle, primarily because, outside of the World Builder engine we discussed previously, there simply wasn't another framework for creating an original point-and-click adventure around this time, and there were very few examples to refer to that might have helped to shape the direction of ICOM's future title. So, rather than attempt to use the limited tools available in the market at the time, the team decided to develop their own adventure game engine, which internally would be known as the Filter Engine, a piece of technology that would end up forming the foundation for their forthcoming game. And here, the Filter Engine would end up using a number of the interface elements and design paradigms that were already present in the base Macintosh user interface, which, like we mentioned, was widely seen as intuitive to use by the general population. ICOM figured if they could take some of those common Macintosh interface elements that people were already used to, and put a game-centric coat of paint on top of them, then perhaps they'd be able to create an adventure game that would be more approachable than the often fiendishly difficult text-based adventures of the time. This goal led to the team imbuing the filter engine with a number of features that, while unique from a gaming perspective, almost directly inherited from concepts already present in the Macintosh ecosystem. Take, for example, the concept of item hierarchies. When users would access and use a Macintosh, the computer's file system was designed to allow for a series of nested folders and documents, both from an organizational perspective as well as to logically mimic the kinds of concepts that existed in the physical rather than digital world, like what you'd often see in file cabinets containing various folders and documents in office buildings of the time. Unlike primarily text-based computers, the Macintosh provided a visual way to mimic this kind of physical file cabinet concept in a digital form, with users able to store a series of folders on their computer, each of which might contain other folders or documents, with the only limit being the extent to which an individual wanted to organize their own personal desktop environment. This concept would prove very popular, and incidentally, would form the foundation of not just future Macintosh iterations, but would also form the concepts behind a lot of Microsoft Windows' earlier graphical user interface efforts. It was that influential. ICOM Simulations decided to mirror this kind of concept, albeit in game form, which the team believed would allow for an intuitive and immersive experience for players. In the world of Deja Vu, this would manifest itself as the game's item hierarchy system, which would allow for various objects to be stored within other objects, with real-world logic dictating how deep that system would go. As an example, let's say your character is wearing a trench coat. Well, that trench coat might have pockets, and in those pockets might be other objects, like a gun, a lighter, some loose change, and a wallet. And those objects might by extension be capable of holding other objects. As an example, a wallet might contain a driver's license or some spare cash, all things that mimicked the real world pretty closely. What you couldn't do, however, was store a gun in a wallet because, well, that simply doesn't make sense. I know, that sounds like a really simple thing to understand conceptually, but actually creating an engine that knew which objects could be nested within others and which ones couldn't took a fair amount of programming time and design work to get just right, especially when you consider that the goal with Deja Vu was to create an experience that felt real, which meant that these kinds of physical constraints that are taken for granted in the real world had to be explicitly considered and developed for inclusion in the game's engine, a step that the team felt was necessary to truly immerse players in their forthcoming adventure. When you consider that adventure game inventories of the time pretty much consisted solely of a text-based list of items rather than visual imagery and icons, and when you consider that exploring game worlds in those games were similarly driven by text descriptions of what objects might be hidden in another object as opposed to visual depictions of embedded objects, you can very clearly see how advanced ICOM's efforts were in comparison to other adventure game developers from the early to mid-80s. Another aspect of that drive for immersive gameplay was the desire to eliminate nearly all keyboard inputs for navigating and interacting with the game world and its characters. Rather than needing to type commands into a text parser, players would instead be allowed the opportunity to point, click, and drag, in the case of moving objects, their way through the game, with a series of common commands appearing as on-screen buttons to click, similar to a very early instantiation of a LucasArts-like SCUM engine interface, while most world interactions could be accomplished by either using those commands on in-game objects, or simply pointing and clicking at objects that might appear in the game world. While the game engine would be designed to include text-based narration to enhance players' understanding of the game's story and its world, the actual interaction with that world would be designed as an entirely mouse-driven affair, something never before attempted to this extent in a prior adventure title. That degree of direct interaction was married with a mature, gritty story that the team hoped would feel like a pulp detective novel, complete with shifty and shady characters, an amnesiac protagonist, and a series of dangerous and potentially deadly situations to navigate and solve in any number of ways. Unlike many of Sierra's early adventure titles that used text to convey information about the game world, but didn't really provide a compelling and deep narrative experience, ICOM was focused on delivering both an intriguing narrative as well as a visually impressive and interactive world, representing a combination of gameplay, visuals, and interactivity that had simply never been seen in an adventure title before. Eventually, all of ICOM's work would culminate in the release of Deja Vu for the Apple Macintosh in October of 1985, at which point the game's engine was rebranded as the MacVenture engine, with Deja Vu becoming the very first MacVenture title released on the market. MacVenture, as you might have surmised, was a contraction of the words Macintosh and adventure, and over the years that would follow, ICOM would be responsible for bringing 3 additional MacVenture titles to the market, including a direct sequel to Deja Vu, as well as the decidedly spookier Shadowgate and The Uninvited, all of which would share the same interface elements, the same general gameplay, and the same level of point-and-click interactivity as Deja Vu. In short, ICOM had created one of, if not the first standard and reusable point-and-click adventure game engine in history, predating Sierra's and LucasArts' more well-known point-and-click engines by years. From a commercial perspective, the MacVenture series would be incredibly successful, with over 2 million copies of the 4 MacVenture titles sold over the course of their respective lifetimes. A truly impressive accomplishment for a company that began its life developing business productivity software. Returning to Deja Vu specifically, upon its release, the game would be critically acclaimed, with various publications claiming that the game set a new standard in adventure gaming, with the game's graphical and mouse-driven interface being noted as a revolutionary concept that no other game on the market could compete with. A fair number of critics would end up naming Deja Vu to be one of the best adventure games of the year, and it would eventually be enshrined in Macworld's Gaming Hall of Fame, with that publication's editors suggesting that Deja Vu avoided nearly all of the common pitfalls of adventure titles of the time, while providing an innovative experience that gamers had never seen before. This level of innovation would result in Deja Vu, as well as the rest of the MacVenture series, being ported to a number of different computer platforms, as well as home consoles like Nintendo's 8-bit NES. Each of those ports would include different improvements and features beyond the base Macintosh version of the game, with some featuring colorized graphics, others featuring higher resolution visuals, and some even adding music to the experience. All of which were attempts to further modernize the original Macintosh experience beyond its somewhat more humble origins. It's a true testament to the popularity of the MacVenture games, as well as how intriguing the underlying MacVenture engine was in comparison to other adventure games of the time, that the games were ported so extensively in such a short period of time, especially when you consider ICOM Simulations was not what anyone would consider to be a high-profile game development studio. It turns out that well-designed gameplay experiences trump brand name recognition any day of the week. With Deja Vu and the MacVenture series a definitive success, ICOM Simulations would begin to make a bit of a name for itself, though still not nearly as pervasively as other adventure game developers of the time. Regardless, ICOM would continue developing games for the rest of its lifetime, including after its acquisition by Viacom New Media in 1993. While the company would explore a variety of gaming genres over the years, a core part of its focus remained in the point-and-click adventure game space that it helped to pioneer back in the early 80s, with the creation of the Sherlock Holmes consulting detective series of titles, several Beavis and Butthead point-and-click adventures, and a number of other standalone efforts rounding out the company's gamography before it was unfortunately shut down in 1997. And that company shutdown is most certainly an unfortunate circumstance. Because, while ICOM Simulations might not have quite the same name recognition as the Sierras and LucasArts of the world, that in no way diminishes its contributions to the adventure game genre, which I would argue were as significant as any of the contributions from the adventure game behemoths of the day. ICOM was able to capture lightning in a bottle by leveraging the unique capabilities of the newly released Apple Macintosh to create a series of games with features that were far more advanced and immersive than the majority of its adventure game development peers, and Deja Vu is a perfect encapsulation of the secret sauce that made ICOM and its MacVenture series so popular in the mid to late 80s. Even though ICOM no longer exists today, and it's not spoken about quite as reverently as other more successful and popular adventure game development studios, ICOM was undoubtedly an influential force in the early adventure game market, and its inaugural title, Deja Vu, remains an important and critical release in adventure game history. beyond a shadow of a doubt, Deja Vu is, much like its name implies, an experience that deserves to be remembered. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Deja Vu today versus when it was released 40 years ago. Deja Vu is, first and foremost, a first-person point-and-click adventure title, and it meets all of the different expectations that you might have when you think about other point-and-click adventures that you might have played. In fact, it is surprisingly modern, despite being one of the very first true point-and-click adventure titles ever made. And while its interface is a bit different than other later adventure games, a good chunk of the game's mechanics will likely feel very similar if you've ever played an adventure title before. The interesting thing is, despite that similarity from a mechanics perspective, there's actually a fair amount of uniqueness in Deja Vu that, to the best of my knowledge, hasn't been widely replicated outside of other games from the MacVenture series, like Shadowgate. While Deja Vu is certainly an older title, there is a lot to like here, and as we'll soon see, the unique aspects of the game's story, interface, and general gameplay are part of what makes Deja Vu a truly special experience. So let's talk about Deja Vu. First though, I should mention that Deja Vu, like we talked about previously, has been released on a number of different computer and console platforms over the years, all of which had different capabilities and features. For this particular episode, I dove into the very first release of Deja Vu, that being the 1985 Macintosh release, which means that the version I played used black and white graphics with no music or audio, short of a couple of very short digitized audio clips that played when certain actions were taken. Future ports of Deja Vu would add different features to presumably attempt to quote-unquote improve the game, with some featuring colorized versions of the original's black and white graphics, others featuring full musical soundtracks, and others still remastering the visuals to look more akin to other point-and-click adventure titles of the early 90s. I personally have experience with 3 versions of the game, those being the original, by virtue of playing through it for this episode, the Apple IIgs version, which featured color graphics but no real audio, and the Nintendo Entertainment System 8-bit console release, which back when I was a kid was my only experience with the game. And I have to mention, I loved Deja Vu on the NES as a kid. I believe I've told this story before, but back when I heard Deja Vu was going to be released on the NES, I was incredibly excited about the prospect of taking on the role of an amnesiac detective, gathering various clues, solving mysteries, and hopefully completing the game successfully. I was so excited that for weeks prior to the game's release, I would call our local Toys R Us every single day to ask whether they had the game in stock yet, only to invariably be met with the same response of no, not yet. One day, however, all of that changed, and the clerk at Toys R Us responded that yes, they had just gotten the game in, which made me squeal with delight, at least in my head. To the clerk, I simply relayed an excited thank you as I hung up the phone and ran to my father to tell him that we needed to go to the toy store now. Like now, because Deja Vu had finally released and I needed to get this game. Luckily for me, my father agreed to my request, and we drove over to Toys R Us, bought the game, and returned home, where I proceeded to become enraptured by the whole experience for weeks. I mention all of this to say, I had a pretty solid amount of experience with Deja Vu before I sat down to play the game for this episode, and playing the NES version remains a permanent cherished memory that I will likely never forget. That being said, as you all know, different versions of games can sometimes yield vastly different experiences, so I was legitimately curious to see if the original title would hold up in comparison not only to the general experience of playing more modern games, but also in comparison to other versions of the game I played in the past. It was with that general thought process that I sat down to play Deja Vu and experience the game's very first released version. The first thing I noticed when I sat down to play the game, outside of the black and white graphics and the lack of any appreciable audio, was the game's interface, which can best be described as a standard Macintosh application retrofitted to run a point-and-click game. Meaning, every single section of the user interface was made up of standard Macintosh-looking windows, with the box that displayed all of the game's narrative and descriptive text looking just like what you would see in a basic Macintosh word processor from 1985, and the game's inventory being effectively a repurposed view of a Macintosh folder, albeit with various Deja Vu-specific icons and game graphics taking the place of the folder, file, and application icons that you'd typically see if you navigated through an early Macintosh's hard drive. All of the commands you can take in the game are represented by standard Macintosh buttons, with each one representing a different verb or action that you can use to interact with the game world, like examine, speak, open, and hit, while other windows allow you to view the game's world, display different entry and exit points from a given scene, and interact with yourself, which at certain points in the game is necessary to progress. Hearing that description of the game's interface, you might be thinking that the gameplay experience might be lacking, or might feel like you were playing a game trapped inside an Office application. Only here, the reality couldn't be further from that assumption. Despite the fact that the game utilized very common Macintosh user interface elements, the way those elements are used in the game itself creates an engaging experience that several minutes after you start playing the game makes you not even realize that you're playing a game without game-specific user interface elements. In fact, I would argue that the interface for Deja Vu is one of the reasons why it's so great, because interacting with the game is dramatically more intuitive than it has any right being. Let's say you see an item or hotspot in the game world that you want to learn more about. Simply double-click that item or hotspot and the game will automatically examine it, displaying some sort of descriptive text in the main narrative text box on the screen. Or let's say you see a closed, albeit unlocked door. Double-click that door and it'll automatically open, as the game has assigned that default open action to the double-click command that most players will naturally attempt to execute when attempting to navigate the game's world. Several other default actions apply to certain objects, though I will admit that not every object has a meaningful default action, which is likely a function of the game's age and the design paradigms prevalent around that time. I mean, remember, the entire concept of a point-and-click adventure title was completely new at this time, and even later point-and-click adventure titles from LucasArts and Sierra would take several iterations before they realized that default actions for certain objects were a good thing to include in their titles. The fact that Deja Vu included this mechanic, despite its age and lack of peer games to draw inspiration from, is truly commendable, and represents a significant innovation that was far beyond its time. Another mechanic that was far beyond its time was the inclusion of on-screen verb actions, which represented one of the ways players could interact with the game world. In a way similar to future Scum-based adventure titles, players could click the various command buttons in the game, followed by clicking an object or a hotspot, and then that command would be executed on that object or hotspot. As an example, let's say you wanted to open a locked door, and you have the appropriate key in your inventory. All you'd have to do is click the key, click on the Operate button, which functions as Deja Vu's version of the typical Use action, and then click on the locked door, which will subsequently unlock that door and allow you to progress further into the game. The interface here is considerably more intuitive than the majority of text-based adventures that existed around this time, and if I didn't know any better, I'd assume that Deja Vu's on-screen verb action buttons were a direct predecessor to LucasArts' eventual Scum verb list. I don't think there was any real inspiration here, or at least I don't recall having read that LucasArts was inspired by the MacVenture series, but hey, you never know. Anyway, even more intuitive than the on-screen command buttons is the way that you interact with the main game world. The way it works is, in the center of the screen, you have a window that represents your viewport into the world of Deja Vu. Within that game world, there are a number of hotspots and objects that can potentially be interacted with. But rather than simply being able to execute commands on those objects and hotspots, you can actually drag and drop those objects using your mouse, whether that means moving items around the game world itself, or dragging an important, or potentially unimportant object into your inventory. This feels entirely natural, as you might expect, because it creates a direct level of engagement with the game world that represents a one-to-one alignment between a player's actions and their impact on that game world. See a note sitting on a bedside table? You don't need to click pick up and then click on the object. You can simply drag it over into your inventory and off you go. Inventory management is similarly intuitive in that you can drag various objects around your inventory window to organize it as you see fit, though I will say that as your inventory grows, it becomes a little bit trickier to keep it nice and tidy. Luckily, the game provides a special cleanup command that, if you execute it, will automatically organize your inventory into a grid-like view, making it so that you can more easily find the item or items you may be looking for. This, however, is a bit of a mixed bag for a couple of reasons. For one, many items in the game are of varying sizes, and the automatic inventory cleanup routine does not do the best job of aligning items of different sizes, which can sometimes result in a less than efficient looking inventory window. The other reason cleanup is a bit less capable than what I would have hoped is that it doesn't seem to sort items into common types. It simply arranges the items in your inventory. It would have been helpful if you could organize your inventory to group all notes, as an example, as opposed to having them strewn about your entire inventory window. It's not a huge deal, but it is something that felt like it could have been improved. Interestingly, there's also a mess up command, which I assume would make your inventory even more disheveled than it otherwise always is. I admit, I did not run this command at all, because I already did a good enough job messing up my inventory as it was. I didn't need the game to do it for me, but I am legitimately curious why this command was included in the first place. Despite the fact that inventory management can be a little cumbersome, I still maintain that the drag and drop interface for accessing and storing items is 100% intuitive, and even beyond your core inventory, certain objects end up acting as containers for other objects, which adds a unique nesting mechanic to the overall gameplay experience. As an example, in your high-level inventory screen, you may have a trench coat, which itself acts as a container for other items, like, say, a gun. Well, that gun may also be a container for other items, like bullets, and in all of these instances, each container presents its own unique inventory screen for you to manage and navigate. You might think this would become tedious over time, but I honestly never found it to be an issue, regardless of the level of nested containers I was dealing with. Though I will admit that I wished there were a few more general items I could have used to better organize my inventory, like perhaps a bunch of boxes. The containers in Deja Vu all behave semi-realistically, in that you're not going to be able to store anything other than bullets in your gun, and you won't be able to store a glass of whiskey in an envelope, so it's not like you can really bend the system to your will. You kind of have to live with what the game gives you, which for the most part is just fine. Outside of the interface, which, like I said, is probably one of the more unique aspects of the game itself, you also have the individual puzzles and gameplay mechanics that make up the experience of actually playing the game. And here, Deja Vu takes a decidedly more logical approach than many other adventure games of the time. We have talked previously about various adventure games, and how they may present zany and occasionally illogical situations that require increasingly crazy and convoluted solutions to address. Well, in Deja Vu, I can safely say that every single situation in the game is 100% logical, and feels completely at home in a noir detective story, with puzzles taking the form of finding clues strewn about the various environments in the game, rather than being explicitly defined as quote-unquote puzzles within the context of the game world. This was a significant breath of fresh air, and one that I didn't even realize I had been missing in the recent games I've been playing. It was so refreshing to play a game and not have to try to figure out what the designers were thinking, but instead be forced to figure out how a semi-intelligent real-world detective would proceed if faced with a similar situation. As an example, if you find a syringe with several vials of medicine, you don't need to figure out how to load the syringe or mix different medicines with each other in order to create a potent curative potion. You simply use the syringe on the medicine and it's loaded and ready to go. The puzzle, so to speak, in this instance, is figuring out what that medicine will ultimately do, and whether it'll make something good happen or something bad happen. And in order to do that, you need to find the appropriate clue in the environment that lets you know what medicines do what. And in order to find that clue out, you need to do something exceedingly logical, which is to examine a doctor's combination-locked filing cabinet. And in order to open that filing cabinet, you don't need to go through a convoluted series of steps to determine some hidden combination. You can simply shoot the drawer and bust it open, the same way as a fictionalized version of a real detective might proceed in a noir-styled film. These puzzles, while not mentally challenging, still involved a degree of logical reasoning, and in some cases logical leaps, and the game does in fact have fairly lengthy puzzle chains in some instances. Those chains are all disguised as traditional detective-centric tasks, like exploring an abandoned house or rifling through a set of drawers in a dresser, but they are all puzzles nonetheless, and they all feel amazingly fun to decipher and figure out. Because, like I said, you really do feel like a detective playing this game. One of the reasons for that feeling is that the game does not hold your hand, and in fact, there are a number of fail-state conditions included here that in many instances devolve into a trial-and-error kind of approach to gameplay, which I've admittedly complained about in prior episodes of the podcast. These somewhat unfair and totally random deaths and dead-end states include moving too far to one side of the street, taking too much time to figure out how to recover your memory, walking into the wrong person at the wrong time on the wrong street corner, running out of cash, whether through too frequent travel or by gambling too excessively, staying too long on the street, after which the cops will arrest you, and a number of other ways that you will most likely fail and be forced to reload the game. Here's the strange thing though. While games like Sierra's classic adventure titles seem to relish the fact that you were going to die and die often, in Deja Vu, it doesn't feel nearly as much like the developers hate the player. Instead, it feels like they built in some random events that, yes, will lead to somewhat unfair deaths, but it was all done in a way to encourage you to learn more about the game and its world. And all of the deaths here are entirely logical, as opposed to the I walked at a rock from the wrong side and ended up crushed kind of design prevalent in some of Sierra's older titles. As an example, at one point in Deja Vu, you may be wandering around the sewer tunnels underneath the street, and may randomly come across an alligator. Unless you know the appropriate counter to that situation, it's highly likely that you'll end up dying and having to reload the game. But the solution here is entirely logical, and once you figure it out, encountering that alligator will be a mere speed bump in the way of the rest of the game. Most of the dead end and death trap situations in the game are exactly like that alligator encounter. You may not know how to tackle it at first glance, but once you figure it out, you realize that the solution is very straightforward, and makes perfect sense given both the context in the game, as well as how you might tackle those situations in real life. The cool thing about many of these situations is that the solutions are provided to you in the very first moments of the game, meaning there is next to no chance of you missing out on picking up the items needed in order to succeed in these random encounters. Now, depending on when those random encounters occur, you may or may not have the necessary resources at your disposal to survive, but that would be due to other gameplay decisions you may have made earlier in your playthrough, not the game hiding the solutions from you. Though, to be fair, there are certain aspects of the game's overarching story and puzzles that are hidden from you, like various locations, the appropriate way to deal with your amnesiac state, and the underlying mystery that you need to solve. The awesome thing here is that discovering those hidden clues makes you feel like a real detective, and I can't speak highly enough about the feeling you get when you examine an item, discover a new address, and then head off to that location via a nearby taxi, with an all-new set of clues to find and mysteries to uncover. Even the taxi system itself enforces the feeling of being a detective, as when you need to speak to the cabbie to get him to take you to a different location, you're not presented with a list of addresses to choose from. You need to know the address you want to travel to, which requires you to have noted that address down somewhere, most likely on real physical paper, which is such a rarity nowadays that it feels awesome to dive deep into a mystery that lets you utilize a real pen and paper to take notes to help you solve the underlying puzzles in a game. Deja Vu gives that to you, and in a way that never feels convoluted or illogical. It simply makes you feel like a detective in a whodunit mystery, and it feels really good to inhabit this world, despite the lack of many modern amenities. In this instance though, the more old-school aesthetic and design actually benefits the game, as it makes you feel even more like you're experiencing an old-timey adventure, a sentiment that I personally really enjoyed. We'll continue talking about some of the more specific aspects of the game in just a minute. But first, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have YouTube, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have gameplay videos we could look up. When we made a buying decision, most of the time that decision was made on reviews we may have read in magazines, word of mouth from family and friends, and what the box actually looked like. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Deja Vu for the Apple Macintosh computer platform, the back of the box says, Deja Vu, a nightmare comes true. Well, kid, you really stepped in it this time. Either you're being framed for a murder, or you really iced the guy. But if I was you, I'd get out of town. Of course, I ain't you, and you ain't got any sense. Knowing you, you'll try to figure it all out. Sheesh, some guys never learn. Do you really think you got a chance with the cops, the mob, and who knows who else all after you? Well, good luck, pal. Oh, by the way, did I mention that you don't even remember who you are? Enter Deja Vu, one of Mindscape's interactive graphic adventures. They're games which draw you into the action. There are no cumbersome commands to type, no guessing what the computer wants. You are totally free to explore and manipulate the deeply textured world created by close to a megabyte of detailed graphic imagery. Deja Vu is like no other adventure you've ever experienced. Beyond that text, there is a single screenshot on the back of the box depicting your character not knowing who the heck he is, along with various paraphernalia that makes sense within the context of the game world, like a ransom note, a fedora, some pills, a syringe with some sort of medicine or other solution in it, and I have got to say, this box 100% sells me on the game. I love everything about this box, including the fact that it looks like something that was ripped right out of a detective film, and I especially enjoyed the fact that the text on the back of the box talked about the fact that this is a game that doesn't require you to guess what the computer wants you to do. It's all graphical, it's all intuitive, it all has a mouse-driven point-and-click interface, which, like we were talking about, was very unique for the time that Deja Vu was released. So yes, this box absolutely sells me on the game. I did not have this particular version of the game when I was younger. Like I mentioned, I had the NES version of Deja Vu, but I've got to say the Macintosh version of the box is one that I absolutely want to eventually have on my game shelf. We're going to move on and start talking about the more specific aspects of the game. We're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics in Deja Vu are 100% black and white, which you might assume would result in a lower level of graphical fidelity or detail than what other full-color titles might allow. Only here, you would be wrong, as Deja Vu looks remarkably detailed given the age of the title, and the entire lack of color in every scene in the game. In fact, I would argue that the limited, literal 1-bit color palette makes the game feel even better to play, because like I mentioned a couple minutes ago, it creates the feeling of experiencing an older noir-styled adventure, similar to the black and white films of the earlier days of cinema. And playing Deja Vu with black and white graphics evokes a sense that you are a true embodiment of a 1940s era hard-boiled detective. And just from a personal perspective, I absolutely loved that feeling. Putting aside my personal love of classic pre-digital history, the simple fact is the graphics in the game are really well done, with nicely detailed environments and character artwork for the various individuals you'll meet throughout your playthrough. I will say that inventory items can occasionally be a little less detailed, and some small objects are definitely lower in detail than other larger items, simply due to the limitations in resolution prevalent around this area of gaming history. As an example, when you look at a spent bullet shell in your gun, you can tell it's a spent bullet shell because it exists in a chamber in your gun. If you were to encounter that bullet casing in the game world without the context of being in your gun, there's very little, if any, chance you'd come to the conclusion that the object was a previously fired bullet. That's not really a knock against the game, as Deja Vu does a really good job of ensuring the appropriate context is available to make up for any lack of detail in some of those lower detailed objects. But looked at from a purely graphical perspective, there are some items that have less overall detail in their design, which once again is ultimately not that big of a deal. The other major element of the game's visual environment that we need to discuss is the game's interface, which, like we mentioned earlier, is based on the general user interface elements that you would typically see in a standard Macintosh application, with windows, text boxes, drop-down menus, and other features that, taken at face value, feel more like what you'd see in an Office application as opposed to a game. Playing Deja Vu, though, it turns out these interface design decisions actually work really well, and despite what you might think when you first see the interface, it turns out that the game is all the better for it. Sure, it'll make the game feel a bit older than other titles, but this is, once again, not an issue here, as it even further plays into the old-time feel of the entire experience. The bottom line is, I loved the visuals in Deja Vu, and other than the limited detail in certain very small objects, I have no complaints. Moving on to the sound and music, there is legitimately very sparse sound in the entire game at all, other than a couple of pre-recorded digital sound effects that correspond to punching something and shooting something, approaching police sirens, and a brief Death Dirge song excerpt that plays if and when you end up dying during your playthrough. Otherwise, there are next to no sounds, music, or anything else audio related throughout the entire game, and I will admit this is one area that makes the game feel a bit older than I would have preferred. Unlike the graphics, which stylistically support the game's narrative setting, the lack of sound is something that left me wanting more. The music you're hearing throughout this episode, by the way, comes from the NES version of the title, which, like I mentioned, is a game that I have a great and everlasting fondness for. I personally think the NES soundtrack for Deja Vu is great, and while I don't think I would take that soundtrack and simply add it into the Macintosh original, I do wish there was more to the audio environment here. Even if there were more pre-recorded digital audio snippets for other actions you take in the game, not necessarily music, but just a broader soundscape, I would be totally fine. As it stands though, the lack of music makes the game feel a bit lonely, for lack of a better term, and is one area where Deja Vu's age definitely shows, and not necessarily in a positive way. It definitely was not enough to detract from my overall enjoyment of the game, but it is something that bears mentioning. Moving on to the narrative and story, in Deja Vu, you play as a private detective that, at the start of the game, wakes up in a toilet stall in the middle of the night, without any memory of how he got there or what's going on. As you begin to survey your surroundings, you realize that not only do you not remember how you got to your present location, but you also realize that you can't even remember who you are. Without any additional information, you grab your trench coat and gun, both of which are hanging on the stall's door, and begin to explore your surroundings. It doesn't take long before you discover a dead body in an office upstairs as the distant sound of police sirens begin to close in on your location. With that set up, it's up to you to figure out who you are, discover how you're involved or not involved in the killing, and ultimately clear your name before you get arrested, or even worse, tracked down and killed by other nefarious individuals. I've got to say, this story 1000% worked for me. I loved the overall setup, from the amnesia-laced beginnings to the eventual mystery around what the heck is going on, to the way you have to piece together all of the game's clues to implicate the bad guys and clear your name. Everything here was amazing. I especially enjoyed the high-stakes feel of the early game, where you have a limited amount of time to restore your memory before you end up falling into a vegetative state forever, which, by the way, is one of the game's many end-state conditions. I will admit, for first-time players, the time limit might feel a bit harsh, as you'll have no idea where you need to go or in what order you need to do things in, and I can guarantee you, you will die as you attempt to piece together the right sequence of events to save your life. This is ultimately all part of the game's charm, and like I mentioned earlier, even though the game has a bunch of different dead-end states, and even though it is a fairly merciless game in its early game time limit, it never feels like the designers behind the game hated players the same way it could sometimes feel Sierra's designers were taking out their own frustrations on unsuspecting gamers. It's a subtle difference in the overall feel of the game, but it is one that makes Deja Vu dramatically more fun to play, despite the deaths and dead-end states, than early Sierra adventure titles. I can't say enough good things about the game's story and overall setup. This is definitely an area where Deja Vu excels from my perspective. Moving on to the playability and controls, we've already talked about pretty much every aspect of the playability and controls for the game, so there's really not much else to mention here. The one thing I want to reiterate though is just how intuitive it feels to play Deja Vu, despite its age. I don't know if that's because the Macintosh itself had a more intuitive user interface than many other computers of the time, and that translated into more intuitive game design, or if something else was at play here. But the fact is that Deja Vu feels way better to play than I would have ever expected given both its age and technology-driven limitations. This is one of those rare examples of a game that was well ahead of its time, and it was simply a joy to play. So, what is our verdict on Deja Vu? Well, it's probably not going to be much of a surprise given our discussion thus far, but Deja Vu is absolutely the newest inductee into our pantheon of classic gaming. It is a truly awesome detective whodunit experience that I believe most people will have fun with, as long as you don't mind playing with black and white graphics and minimal sounds. Assuming you can open your mind to an experience that, at least at face value, looks old, you'll find a game that is more modern than it has any right being, and a deeply engaging experience that will make you want to play it again and again, until finally you figure out how to make your way through the game successfully. People who don't like any degree of trial and error gameplay will likely be put off here, but for everyone else, I highly encourage you to give it a shot. Or fire up the NES version and enjoy full color graphics with a really strong 8-bit soundtrack. Honestly, you can't go wrong with Deja Vu. It is simply a good game, which is why Deja Vu has just become the newest member of our pantheon of classic gaming. That was our episode on Deja Vu. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Sid Meier's Sim Goth, so feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services. And if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can, The only way to do that is to get feedback from you, the listener community, to make sure I am hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to build this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Sid Meier's Sim Golf. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.